And we just received positive news in this fight with the announcement that there's been progress made toward a successful vaccine. Soon, the expectation is the FDA will run a process of rigorous reviews and approvals. And the process must also be grounded in science and fully transparent so the American people can have every confidence that any approved vaccine is safe and effective.
That was President-elect Joe Biden Monday discussing the cautiously optimistic news about Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine trials. Early analysis shows the vaccine to be more than 90% effective in preventing COVID-19 when compared to a placebo. It's not the only development. Last night, the Food and Drug Administration approved emergency use of Eli Lilly's antibody drug to treat coronavirus patients with mild to moderate symptoms. Bina Venkataraman joins me now. She's an editorial page editor for the Boston Globe, and she worked with President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in response to the Ebola pandemic. Bina, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. You were last on the show this summer to talk about how President Trump was undermining the potential trust in a vaccine. How do you feel about the situation now, 4 months later?
Well, one of the fears was that the pressure that the White House and particularly President Trump was putting on drug companies, the announcement he was making that we would have a vaccine before the election, was unnecessarily sowing mistrust in the process, in the regulatory process, and could potentially lead to public fears and mistrust of the vaccine. Now, what's happened with Pfizer making this announcement after the election, and also of note, is that Pfizer was not part of the White House's Operation Warp Speed. It does have what's known as an advanced market commitment, a contract with the federal government to make sure that Americans will get 100 million doses of this vaccine if it's ultimately approved and proven to be safe and effective when the full data are in. But Pfizer putting out this announcement after the election, I think, does a lot of good in terms of earning public trust, showing that this wasn't a political gambit for the president to be able to have a way to declare victory before the election, but rather grounded in the data and grounded in the science. And I do think the FDA Commissioner Steve Hahn, who is part of the Trump administration, deserves some credit for this, for having pushed back on the White House, on President Trump, as they were trying to accelerate the timeline for approval for these vaccines, and instead saying, let's get the full data. Let's put out standards that require companies to complete phase 3 clinical trials and to enter all their safety data before they can be given, and what's known as an emergency use authorization, which is essentially an early approval.
Well, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar predicted this morning that there would be enough vaccine for general public vaccination campaigns by late March, early April 2021. Even with fast-tracked FDA approval, do you think that's realistic?
Well, it's a bit premature to say. If you talk to public health experts right now, including the former head of the CDC, previous years from the Obama years, Tom Frieden, was just speaking about this today. We really don't know until we see the full data. The public hasn't seen the full data from this trial, from the Pfizer vaccine. The public hasn't been able to look at the safety data, which are not going to be complete for another couple of weeks. That said, the early data are very promising. The degree of effectiveness, if it bears out, if it's peer-reviewed and shown to be effective in particularly elderly populations, if it's effective at preventing transmission and not just illness, it's hugely promising and can be hugely transformative. But having one effective and safe vaccine is actually not the same as having a public vaccine campaign, a public vaccine program. So one of the things that we need to do is see how the other vaccines that are under development now bear out, what kind of data are produced from them, what kind of review they get from the FDA's advisory panels, and then to see how those vaccines can be scaled up in terms of their production. We are dealing with a novel, a new kind of vaccine platform based on messenger RNA, which has never been done before. And it's really exciting scientifically. It holds a lot of promise for future vaccines, but it does raise questions about how quickly the production of vaccines can happen. Also, with this particular vaccine from Pfizer, it has to be stored at something like 95 degrees Fahrenheit in order to be transported. So there's going to be some particular
right,
distribution questions, right? And part of what we need to do is think about how that distribution question affects how global access to this vaccine happens, because we know that protecting people just within the confines of the U.S. is not enough, that we're going to need to fight this pandemic all around the world in order for it not to ricochet back to the United States, and for that matter, as a matter of humanitarian leadership in the world.
Well, on his new transition website, President-elect Biden says the administration plans to implement mask mandates nationwide by working with governors and mayors. But Bina, what happens if states or localities refuse to do that?
Well, it's clear that having people wear masks across the country would be a very good thing, and that right now we have a patchwork of state policies, a number of states that don't have any kind of mask advisory or mandate. But the question of how to actually enforce it and how to actually get states and localities to encourage their citizens to adopt wearing masks, and for that matter, to get people to wear masks, is a different question. So the federal government certainly has some levers, some ways of coercing states and local governments to cooperate. Think about the way that the federal highway funds are used to encourage states to have speed limits and to require seatbelts and to enforce that by law. Or think of the way that education funding at the national level encourages states and localities to make certain reforms to schools. So that can be done. But I think if you look at the perspective of what gets people to actually make behavior change and how hard it is to enforce people wearing masks, you can't have police going around checking every single person who doesn't have a mask, finding them. For one, you're going to put some law enforcement officers in danger of doing that. So the way I think about this, I've written a book about how to help people adopt short-term inconveniences that are good for the greater long-term benefit of humanity, called the Optimist Telescope. And one thing that we really have to do is think about social norms, setting peer norms within groups of people, and looking at who can influence those people. So President Biden can certainly set a really good example. Governors and mayors can set a great example for their citizens by talking about wearing masks, by actually wearing masks. Now, keep in mind, we haven't had a president of the United States wearing a mask. So just the fact of the President of the United States, President-elect Joe Biden, wearing a mask will go a long way. But I think we also need to look at other kinds of influencers, people who affect, people who might not be enthusiastic about a Biden presidency. So it might require celebrity influencers, country music stars. And I think it really needs to be something where we think about it from the point of view of behavior change and not just a sort of rigorous punishment.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if behavior changes, because we are living in a time, as you well know, Bina, where norms have been violated. And to some extent, what was once not normal has become normal for some people. So it was great talking to you, Bina Venkataraman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Elaine. It was great to talk with you.